amidst all the violence going on around George Floyd and people out there saying, but you gotta work within the system, you gotta support Joe Biden, in terms of it, is that 1920 is the 150th anniversary of the 15th Amendment. The 15th Amendment to the Constitution was basically allowing blacks to vote. And this was a highly controversial move in the wake of emancipation. And for 3-4 years, Washington really had no idea of who are these freed slaves. Are they citizens? Are they simply ex-slaves that we can send back to Africa? Whatever on that itself. There's an increasing amount of turbulence sweeping the country. There's a great deal of violence in the South. Armed gangs are emerging in the South. The Ku Klux Klan to go and beat and destroy, intimidate the freed men, as the freed slaves were known of that itself there. And by 1869, 1870, there was this obvious feeling that something had to be done amidst all of that, because among other things, the freed blacks are arming themselves, and they are forming their own paramilitary units. And when the Klan is attacking them, they are fighting back. And amidst all of this, there is this increasing fear from Washington that if we don't do something, suddenly we're going to have a new civil war where there's going to be massive delegations of armed blacks that are going to fight back and stand up for themselves. And isn't it a lot better for people to be out there working within the system, registering to vote, and all of those details of this, than to go and actually have the direct action of that? And that's the real origins of the 15th Amendment, and the fact that you're still having renewed violence, questions about working within the system, whether voting really matters, shows the progress we've made over the last 150 years. So with that said, are there questions, comments? Because where we are right now is a bland newcomer compared to the debates over suffrage in 1870. But 1870 is the year that Denver is starting to emerge as a real city with the arrival of the railroad, and soon Denver's population is soaring from about 4,700 people to 32,000 people within 10 years. And as Denver is booming in that period, it has a strong industrial area, Auraria. And Auraria is not simply the home of slaughterhouses and packing plants and numerous mills, bakeries, pickle factories, so forth. It also has a strong middle-class base, and middle-class homeowners are very proud of putting up houses of distinction at that time, and nobody is ready to drill his fellow citizens more at this period than William Smedley. And William Smedley is the pioneer dentist of Colorado of that itself there, and he puts this up as his house as a latecomer about 1872 or so of that. But here you have on 9th Street Park something of the location where Denver sort of re-began in the 1870s, and with no credit to the Auraria Higher Education Center, citizens activists managed to save one block of 9th Street in the 1970s to allow places like 1040 9th Street to survive. This is sometimes called Casa Mayan because for years, besides being the home of the Gonzalez family, this was also the home of a very distinctive Mexican restaurant, Casa Mayan, that is killed in 1970, 1971 by the Auraria Higher Education Commission when it goes and basically destroys Auraria as a residential neighborhood to make way for the college campus. And here you have, by 1970, is another year of extreme upheavals sweeping the country. You have not just protests against the Vietnam War occurring at that period, you also are having extreme repression as is seen at Kent State. Meanwhile, the Southern police are behaving even more than usual, which is if there is a disorder, i.e. a black youth daring to question the authority of a police officer, the solution to this is very simple. You simply shoot them. And there's a number of mass shootings of black students that follow in the wake of Kent State in the spring of 1970. At the same time that all of that was going on, Denver is in turmoil about the nature and future of its schools. And in particular, in the course of the 1950s, there is this massive influx of middle-class blacks from the South coming to Denver. Most of them are brought into the city by the military. They see the military as a non-discriminatory, equal opportunity agency. Many are very, very proud of the achievements they make in the military. Of that, they settle in, and while they claim to detect racism in Denver, they claim it's nothing like what they had experienced in the South. And as they are aspiring to good middle-class locations, they're concerned about the schools. And in particular, there is no location that the middle-class military veterans like more at this period than along the northern edge of the City Park Golf Course between Colorado Boulevard and York Street, just off to the north of 26th Avenue there. And as they are starting to settle in the mid-1950s, that area in no time goes from being a pretentious, arriving white neighborhood into a black middle-class section, and most of the children that are there land up going and being bused over to Park Hill School at 19th Avenue and Elm Street. And at this time, Park Hill School is the place that's just a little bit above every place else, a little bit more impressive. And the biggest snob location you can imagine within the community of that. And for years there'd been a lot of racial tensions in Park Hill, and Park Hill School goes from being virtually 100% white. Now with the busing in of the children of the black military veterans professionals, it's maybe 70% white, 30% black. And is it fair for the black children to have to get up extra early, wait for the bus to come, go over to Park Hill School, get herded in the auditorium, wait for the bell to begin the day, then at the end of the day go back to the auditorium, wait for the bus bell, and then get driven home of that? Wouldn't it be better to have a nice neighborhood school for them that they can walk to, that their parents would know the teachers nearby, whatever on that? And that is the decision of Denver's school superintendent, Kenneth K. Oberholzer. Kenneth K. Oberholzer was once God in Denver. He is hired by Denver Public Schools in 1947 as this masterful educator, superintendent of schools, the man who knows exactly how the schools tick locally, how they tick nationally, a very good speaker. Whenever a television needs an interview of an expert on public schools, there's Kenneth K. Oberholzer on camera. When Time magazine needs to illustrate who is the most illustrious school superintendent in the country, it selects Kenneth K. Oberholzer. And typical of Kenneth K. Oberholzer is he grew up in Tulsa, where his father was superintendent of schools. He graduates from Tulsa High School in 1920 and goes up to Illinois to college. It never registers on him of what happens in Tulsa a year after his graduation, when there is this massive white organized terrorist riot that sweeps through the heart of Black Tulsa, burns down, destroys, murders anybody of middle-class Black Tulsa. As part of the operations of that, rather, Kenneth K. Oberholzer goes to work first as a principal, then as a superintendent in Texas, where he's very comfortable with Jim Crow. He later goes out to Long Beach, California, before he is recruited to Denver, and his policies as superintendent basically is there should be one set of schools for the whites and one set of school for the blacks. And towards this end, he basically goes and pushes the erection of Barrett School as the black school, so Park Hill School can remain the white school of town. And this just sets off this massive explosion where through the 1960s there are rumblings that Denver Public Schools is a racist institution. The schools that Black Denver has to send its students to are old and decrepit. But we built Barrett as a brand new school, so they wouldn't go to Park Hill School. We built Manual High School as a brand new school, so you could destroy the neighborhood and kick people out. And there just seems to be no consensus, no agreement until Martin Luther King is assassinated. And by this time, there's a liberal majority on the 7-member Denver School Board, and it lands up adopting something called the Noel Plan. And the Noel Plan is named for Rachel Noel. She's among these middle-class, professional blacks who's arrived in Denver after World War II. Her husband is a leading physician of that, and she was outraged that her children couldn't ride the bus to Park Hill School. They had to go to Barrett School. She lands up being elected to the school board in 1967 of that. And in the wake of the upheavals following King's death, she pushes through this resolution declaring Denver Public Schools is going to make a good faith effort to integrate the schools so all students get the same quality, equal educational opportunity. And the way these systems, new superintendent, Gilberts, decides he's going to do this is by busing Black children out of Northeast Denver, including increasingly Black sections of Northeast Park Hill, to Southeast Denver and South Central Denver of that. And that lands up being the focus of a very nastily fought school board election in May 1969. And basically the election in 1969 is there's a couple of Republican stalwarts who would be fully comfortable with Donald Trump, who were then fully comfortable with Richard Nixon, of going and saying, you know what, supporting those people mean it's going to destroy our systems, and we have to have neighborhood schools. And against this, the advocates of the equal educational opportunity land up supporting a couple of 17th Street liberal lawyers, Edgar Benton and Monty Pasco, who are simply saying, we're doing the right thing on this. And a lot of White Park Hill is supporting integration. A lot of the country club is supporting integration. And part of the reason they're doing so is they want to save East High School as their beloved white achieving academy at this time. But it's to no avail. The neighborhood school ticket of James Perrell and Frank Southworth overwhelmingly triumphs, and school busing is dead. And no sooner has the school board declared school busing is dead than the advocates of school busing turn around and they land up suing Denver Public Schools. And they claim that federal law is that all children must have the right to equal educational opportunity. And that equal educational opportunity, by definition, is integrated education. There is a hearing on this in front of United States District Court Judge William Doyle in the summer of 1969. And Doyle, who's something of a Cold War liberal, who sends his children to Catholic schools, agrees that yes, we must have integration in Denver public schools regardless of what the voters said. And in the wake of this, there's appeals to the higher courts, there's last-minute stays, there's last-minute orders, but in the fall of 1969, limited busing for racial integration begins in Denver. Then there's the trial over the matter in 1970, and once more the plaintiffs convince Judge Doyle of their views, and by this time, 1970, Denver is on the verge of explosion over racial tensions. Denver is on the verge of explosions over anti-war feelings. The FBI even sends a couple of people in to help Denver anti-war protesters in the summer of 1970 when Vice President Spiro Agnew comes to town. And the way the federal agents help the anti-war protesters is they just conveniently manage to throw ice at the police, lead a group into a total dead-end area right by the Colorado Convention Center, and by sheerest coincidence, the only escape from that dead end is a door out of which about 50 members of the Denver riot squad of the police department come out, beating people along the way out of it there. So that's just, again, a little of the background of what's going on here. But by the way, are there questions, comments, rebuttals yet on this itself? Otherwise, I'll just keep on like this for the next hour. But anyway, amidst all these activities, meanwhile, we sort of have escaped another pivotal year along the way, and that is 1920. And 1920, 100 years ago, is another year of extreme angst, extreme violence, worries, whatever. And this was something of a reflux of World War I. And in the wake of World War I, we're going to make things just like they are before. We're not going to build the new order. Black soldiers come back, white soldiers come back, there's limited space. And the summer of 1919 is sometimes called the Red Summer because there is such violence and numerous race riots sweeping the country during this period. In terms of that, 1919 is also a period of mass strikes where labor is organizing, walking out in protest of the massive loss of buying power they had suffered during the war out of it, and everybody knows who's responsible for this. It's the communists. And not only do we recently have the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia on this, where United States troops have invaded the old Russian Empire to try to bring liberty against the Bolsheviks of this, but sure enough, a new Communist Party USA lands up emerging in September 1919. In fact, the Communist Party is doing so well in the United States, there's soon two separate Communist parties where they're fighting each other as much as the establishment there, and something needs to be done about this. And nobody is more assured of doing something about this than A. Mitchell Palmer, Attorney General. And Mitchell Palmer is a former Philadelphia Quaker, advocate of brotherhood, goodwill, and then he takes the post of Attorney General, and he decides that the way to assure peace and goodwill is to suppress anybody and everybody who dares question the policies of Washington during World War I. Washington conducts massive crackdowns. It arrests people, and among the reasons you can be arrested and sent to a federal penitentiary for upwards of 20 years is by quoting Woodrow Wilson's pre-World War I anti-war speeches. Along the way out of it, they are, and again, this time, 1920, the leader of the Socialist Party is Eugene V. Debs, who's been campaigning every 4 years for president since 1900. He campaigns again for president in 1920. He campaigns while he is an inmate of Atlanta Federal Penitentiary because he had dared to denounce World War I in terms of these activities. So there's this increasing set of crackdowns, and nobody is doing a better job of sort of going and working and coordinating with A. Mitchell Palmer of Justice Department crackdowns than the head of something called the Bureau of Investigations, a former librarian, J. Edgar Hoover. And J. Edgar Hoover had learned a lot as a librarian of that. And among the things a librarian has to know is how to classify, how to catalog books and other things. And he takes the latest in library cataloging technology and figures in the same way a library makes a card on every book it has on this. The Department of Justice must make a card on every suspect character in the country and use a kind of library reference system so we'll know where all the reds are on that. And once having drawn up this list of who all the reds are, where they supposedly live, on New Year's Day, 1920, the feds stage these massive raids across the country. There's a second set of raids on January 2nd, and just this total, complete crackdown of activities is part of what's going on. And soon there are massive scares. Bombs are exploding, and who's sending these bombs? It's unclear. One bomb blows up near lunchtime in the middle of Wall Street, killing about 25 people. A bomb arrives at the house of Attorney General Mitchell. His maid is badly injured in receiving the package in terms of this. And isn't this more evidence of this nefarious, anti-fascist, whatever terrorist conspiracy going on in terms of this? And J. Edgar Hoover and A. Mitchell Palmer agree. May Day is coming up, the 1st of May, the International Communist holiday. And they announced that country has to be prepared, because if it is not prepared, there is going to be this red rising and the Soviet Republic of America is going to emerge. And sure enough, on May 1st, 1920, the communists arise, they overthrow the government, and that's the origin of Soviet America. Did you miss that in your history books? So maybe that didn't happen. Actually, nothing happened on May Day 1920 in consequence of that. And suddenly the enthusiasm for bombs and spies and arrests and turning people in tends to dissipate rather rapidly in the course of 1920. And meanwhile, a presidential election is looming. And the presidential election is one of those things where we can look at the 1920 election as opposed to the 2020 election and wonder in which election did voters have a wider, better choice of what was going on this. The incumbent Democratic president, Woodrow Wilson, has served 2 terms. What's more is since late 1919, he had been basically incapacitated in the White House. He had suffered a couple of extreme strokes, and he's in this miserable position. He's alert, he knows exactly what is going on, but he has this terrible time trying to communicate what is going on, and other than for his physician and his wife, he has no contact with the outside world. And meanwhile, Wilson is projecting himself as not simply president, he is the savior. He is the man who has the plan to make the world safe for democracy, and if people only listen to him, we will have salvation. And this is the situation when the Democratic National Convention meets. And Wilson wants renomination, but his machine has collapsed with him being in ill health on that itself. So they come up with an inspiring hack from Ohio named Cox, former governor of Ohio, as the Democratic candidate, somebody with no charisma, no record of challenging anything, no alternative to anything. Meanwhile, the Republican race in 1920 is also quite wide open. There's a number of former and acting generals that want the nomination as something of the great man on horseback that can come in and save the country itself. There's the usual political contenders, and then there is the senator from Ohio, Warren G. Harding. And Warren G. Harding should be on some U.S. currency. More than anybody else, he's the president that looked like a president. Rather handsome, very much a ladies' man, constant affairs going on. In terms of this, a complete total void in terms of knowing any policy, but a decent speaker, whatever of that. In other words, he's a good dummy for a ventriloquist to be manipulated itself on that. And this is the situation when the Republican bosses meet in Chicago during the National Convention of the Republicans in the famous smoke-filled room. And by the time all the smoke lands up clearing, the Republican elite decides that yes, indeed, Warren G. Harding is going to be the Republican nominee for president. And he has a very, very simple platform in 1920, which is normalcy. Whether the word normalcy actually existed then has been debated of this, but it's basically we've had enough of the Crusades, we've had enough of saving Europe, we've had enough of these idealistic social experiments. Let's just go back to the good old days of the last Ohio president or two, William McKinley of the 1890s itself on that. And meanwhile, the Cox campaign has zero dynamism, and Warren G. Harding makes his way into the White House with nearly 60% of the vote that November. And actually, he proves in office to be a far, far more liberal man in Washington than Woodrow Wilson was, because after a while, Harding starts saying, why are we locking all these guys up for 20 years, 15 years? And he actually issues a large number of pardons and commutations of sentences against political dissidents that Woodrow Wilson never would of that. Another thing that Warren G. Harding also believes in is something called the public-private partnership. And in particular, there's something like public oil lands up in Wyoming, where just off to the north of Casper, there's a very, very rich oil field called Teapot Dome. And his principle is, since that's public land, shouldn't we turn this over to the private sector itself on that? And among his top advisors is a guy named Harry Sinclair, who just happens to be the owner of, guess what, petroleum company out of this there. And meanwhile, he has a thorough crook, Albert B. Fall, former senator from New Mexico, as Secretary of the Interior. So it's basically looting the public trust as usual is part of the Warren G. Harding technique. And meanwhile, as Warren G. Harding's scandals and the inside problems of Washington are growing in 1923, and some of his sexual predicos are also coming to the fore, he's making this grand national tour of the country. And he becomes the first sitting United States president to visit Alaska. And something is wrong with his food up in Alaska, and that's the end of Warren G. Harding as president of that there. So that's just a little of the sidelight in terms of that. Meanwhile, Denver is also reflecting the Red Scare, the upheavals, the strikes going on. And in 1919, the old Robert Speer machine had collapsed. Robert Speer had dominated Denver as mayor from 1904 till his death in 1918. When he dies in office in 1918, a guy named W.F.R. Mills takes over. And W.F.R. Mills is basically this corporate bureaucratic executive, no dynamism, no links really with the party machinery itself on that. And amidst all of these activities, he's pushed aside by Dewey Bailey. Dewey Bailey is a cattle rancher from Douglas County. Good political hack that always does what his party tells him to do, and he is rewarded for this in the 1890s by being named United States Marshal for Colorado, top federal law enforcement official in the state of that. And he sort of sticks in that position for almost 20 years until he moves over to become Denver manager of safety under Mayor Speer. And the manager of safety is the civilian official who is in charge of overseeing the police department. And as U.S. Marshal for Colorado, as manager of safety for Denver, Dewey Bailey knows who the crooks of Denver are. But rather than cracking down on them or arresting them or chasing them out of town, he also believes in the public-private partnership of this, which is basically especially among con artists, and Denver at this time is the national headquarters of con artists, if the con men agree they will not gyp locals and simply prey on fellow businessmen and especially affluent tourists of this, City Hall will wink its eye if the con men make the proper contributions to the retirement accounts of certain people around the police department and other such things of that itself. And meanwhile, Dewey Bailey also uses the police department as something of his political enforcement squad of that, and he becomes the Republican candidate for mayor in 1919. And against this, Cass Harrington is the Democratic candidate. And Cass Harrington lived right across the street from your old house over at the southeast corner of 7th Avenue and Emerson Street. And Cass Harrington, big corporate attorney, closely linked with something called CF&I, Colorado Fuel and Iron, something owned by the Rockefeller Corporation. And among other things, in 1914, Colorado Fuel and Iron arranges for members of the Colorado National Guard to shoot down striking workers at a tent colony of Ludlow between Trinidad and Walsenburg in April 1914, and nobody's out there more defending the Ludlow massacre, the conduct of CF&I, than Cass Harrington. So the voice is, who do you want as mayor? A total crook or a corporate enforcer of an even bigger crook, the Rockefeller families? And on this basis, Dewey Bailey is elected mayor of Denver in 1919, and meanwhile, the city is further exploding. And no section of the city is more on the verge of explosion than the Denver Tramway Corporation. At this time, utilities had this overwhelming control of defining the city itself. And in particular, the water company was every place. In 1918, Denver buys out the water company. The phone company operates on the principle, we have a monopoly and you do things our way and you pay our price or you don't have phone service. There's gas and electric, the forerunner of Excel, that often behaves about the same way. And then there's Denver Tramway, and it runs the streetcars around town. And this is the time when Denver is very much a streetcar city. Upwards of 90% of all trips to and from the central business district are taken via tramway itself. And often it is you pay tramway's fare, you wait on tramway, you pay their transfer fare, or you walk, or find some other way of getting around the city of this. And for years, tramway had been under the sway of somebody named Napoleon Evans. And Napoleon Evans was William Gray Evans. He was the son of Colorado Governor John Evans, and he just had this commanding link to City Hall during the first 15 years of the 20th century. By 1913, his health is starting to collapse. He needs to step back, and the Betcher family comes on the scene and buys the controlling interest of Denver Tramway. Now, the Betcher family goes back to Charles Betcher, who's a draft dodger from Prussia, who arrives first in Wyoming in the 1860s. For a while, he's up in Fort Collins, he's in Boulder, he hits it rich up in Leadville, comes to Denver, and over the years with his son Clyde, the Betchers just have this amazing empire, and everything from blasting powder to utility to sugar beets to the potash industry, merchant banking. There's numerous charities, halls named for the Betcher family. The only thing I've never been able to connect with the Betcher family is life insurance, which is too bad because then we could have had Betcher Life. But anyway, in terms of those activities, and part of the way that the Betcher family had established its fortune, very, very sharp businessmen, they knew what a penny was, and they would fight for that penny. And especially when you're dealing with tens of thousands of riders a day on the streetcar, a penny does add up in terms of it. And meanwhile, Tramway had a franchise with the city saying that there will be always a 5-cent fare on the streetcar for the 20-year duration of the 1906 franchise. But now we have World War I. There's massive inflation going on, and Tramway claims it can't afford to operate at 5 cents a ride. It wants 6 cents or 7 cents or 8 cents of that, and obviously riders that are hard pressed are fighting back. And you think, well, what's a nickel a fare of this? Well, at this time, a hard pressed worker was lucky to make $1 a day. A trip going and coming from work, that's 10% of your earnings right off in terms of it there. And besides, the service is just so atrocious of that. And meanwhile, Tramway treats its workers as dirt. It refuses any recognition of them. And in the wake of World War I upheavals, Tramway workers land up going and organizing this itself. And they catch Tramway unprepared when they go out on strike in July 1919, and they win a decent wage settlement. And no sooner have they won the decent wage settlement, than two things happen. Tramway does its most to try to reverse the activities there because it claims it can't afford it of this, and it also is preparing to spend any amount necessary to go and bust the union. And in the course of July 1919 to August 1920, there is just fight after debate after commission over what is the status of the streetcar workers. Finally, in early August 1920, Tramway is prepared. It brings Blackjack Jerome to town. John Blackjack Jerome just happens to be a friendly guy who loves to play blackjack. Or does he always carry a blackjack and have a group of goons around him that know how to use their blackjacks to club striking workers and anybody else that is the target of those that hire Blackjack Jerome and his mercenary force of that itself there. And so basically, Blackjack Jerome brings in hundreds of goons, strikebreakers from San Francisco in early August 1920. The workers know what's going on, and they declare a strike immediately of that itself, and virtually all 900 members of the streetcar workers union go out on strike in terms of this. And meanwhile, the goons announce they are going to go and operate the streetcars. And it's one thing to know how to use your blackjack on people. It's quite different than being actually able to operate a streetcar in traffic. And soon there's numerous crashes, and Tramway responds by putting heavy metal grates around some of its cars, and it puts extra tanks in its cars that are filled with soap suds. So if anybody comes and dares challenge the streetcars, one of the Blackjack Jerome's goons will have his nozzle from the soap tank to shoot people coming out in terms of it, and soon violence is escalating. Sabotage is used by the striking workers. Some of the cars are tipped over. Violence is flaring, and there just constantly seem to be these strange provocations of violence, usually wherever Blackjack Jerome is on that. For example, there used to be a car house of Tramway at South Broadway and West Alaska Place. And Alaska Place was about 2.5 blocks to the south of Alameda Avenue. Jerome is there. There's a mysterious fire, and suddenly gunfire breaks out, and a couple of 19-year-old youths that were bystanders are murdered in the process. Then there is the East Side car house, which was over at 35th Avenue at about Gilpin Street there. That's ground zero of the camping spot of the strikebreakers. The workers protest. Others protest. Blackjack Jerome comes by on something like August 5th, 1920 at about 9 p.m. Suddenly gunshots ring out. 5 pro-striking workers are shot down and murdered in the process. A dozen other people wounded in terms of that itself there. And amidst this, our friend Dewey Bailey, mayor of Denver, he sees nothing. Gee, shouldn't a private army have the right to bring its armed enforcers into the city of this? And then as the workers start fighting back on that, he figures maybe he should call in the National Guard. But the National Guard is hated because of the Ludlow massacre. So about August 7th, he works with the War Department to land up going and getting federal troops to come into town, and that breaks the strike. Because the strikers, they don't want to fight federal troops that itself, and with federal troops sort of providing gunpowder and power for the streetcars, slowly the replacement workers learn how to drive it of this. Another interesting detail about the 1920 strike on this is as the federal troops are withdrawing, they have all sorts of fancy extra war equipment from the fields of Europe that they don't need. Let's give this extra military equipment to the Denver Police Department so it can be as much a paramilitary operation to shoot down strikers as simply a force of preserving and protecting order through the city. Well, the overall upshot of all of this lands up being is the strike is crushed miserably. Denver labor as a whole is crushed miserably. And for the next half dozen years at least, all life, all vitality is sucked out of the Denver labor movement. And in many ways, the Denver labor movement never recovered from all of that itself, of a collaborationist activity. But that's a long story in and of itself. So questions, comments, ideas, rebuttals? Well, I'm getting tired right now, so I'm going to sit down for this here because we now still need to go into other dimensions. Well, meanwhile, 1970 is one of these years where it's hard to say where the country is going. 1968 appeared to be a year of apocalypse. Assassinations, riots, chaos, a charismatic candidate running for president as a third-party challenger, George Wallace, with a thinly veiled racist taunt in terms of it. The Democratic candidate in 1968, Hubert Humphrey, is an old-time liberal warrior who's still fighting a battle in Minnesota politics of 1948 against racial discrimination. And for years, Hubert Humphrey is one of these guys. Do you want to be president? Yeah. You want to be president? And he keeps failing at his various presidential bids out of it until 1964. And that year, Lyndon Johnson taps Humphrey to be his vice president. And in many ways, Humphrey was the ideal vice president for Lyndon Johnson. Whatever Johnson wanted, Humphrey did for him. He was an echo. He was a very, very verbose echo. He was the kind of guy you asked him a simple question and he can go on for a half hour in terms of the answer in terms of it. And originally, Lyndon Johnson was thinking 1968 would be a great year for re-election for him. And the Democratic Party, for the most part in 1968, is frustrated with Johnson, but it's filled with cowards that are afraid to go and take on Johnson. There's anti-war voices out there, but they're not quite clear what to do. And this is the situation when Eugene McCarthy comes back on the scene. Eugene McCarthy is a college professor from Minnesota who's also quite a sharp politician. And for a while, he served in the United States Senate from Minnesota with Hubert Humphrey. Among his other achievements, Eugene McCarthy, back in the 1950s, had been among the few distinguished politicians that stood up to Joe McCarthy and called Joe McCarthy into account. But Eugene McCarthy was never a crusader. He never was out on the picket lines of this. He'd be saying, yes, there's problems with the war, but he wasn't a leader of this. And it's basically when nobody else was willing to go and take on LBJ in 1968 that Gene McCarthy decides he's going to be the liberal challenger. And nobody helps him more as being the liberal challenger than a good Denver boy, Buster Brown. Buster Brown is Sam Brown. His father was the owner of Buster Brown Shoes. And Sam Brown is one of these golden youths of the 1960s, well-educated, well-connected. At one time, he's an operative for the CIA through something called the National Student Association, where he goes to international conferences supposedly representing American students with money being paid by the CIA of that. Well, anyway, he decides that the media is right. By 1968, the scruffy hippies have arrived on the scene. And as the scruffy hippies have arrived, boys are starting to grow beards and mustaches. And their hair is growing over their ears.
You got a little milk on yours.
Yeah, okay.
The camera, I just noticed it. Sorry.
No, well, see, that's what happens. You have these mustaches.
It matched what you were talking about.
Well, anyway, amidst all of this, the establishment goes crazy about long-haired men. In fact, various Denver public schools have these policies where principals, assistant principals have rulers, and if the boy's hair is too long, they send him to the barber, and either you go to the barber and you get the haircut, or you're not allowed in school or on extracurricular activities of this. And we can't have these scruffy hippies going and campaigning for Gene McCarthy. Rather, what Buster Brown is saying, we have to be clean for Gene. And he leads a national student campaign for students like him, mostly Ivy League, upper middle class background, to shave off their beards, mustaches, have crew cuts, and troop up to New Hampshire in February 1968 to campaign for LBJ. And actually, LBJ wins the New Hampshire primary, but he only does so by about 50% of the vote. And the way that Gene McCarthy got 40% of the vote is something of a shock on this. Meanwhile, the Vietnam War is going from bad to worse. The racial tensions are going on, and increasingly, LBJ realizes he's in trouble. And the upshot is at the end of March 1968, he announces that he's not running for president. And with him not running for president, there just happens to be an outstanding opportunist on the scene to run for president, and that is Bobby Kennedy. And for almost from the time John Kennedy went into the White House, a war is going on between Bobby Kennedy and Lyndon Johnson. The two have very, very uncomplimentary words for each other, words that need to be censored thoroughly in terms of that. For Bobby Kennedy and his crowd, LBJ is old Corpone, the person to be totally isolated and to have absolutely no influence whatsoever. John Kennedy knows better than that. Sometimes when he needs special lobbying in Congress or somebody to represent the United States abroad, he turns to LBJ. But it's obvious that Bobby Kennedy and Lyndon Johnson are never going to work at all well together on that itself. And Kennedy had refused to challenge Johnson prior to the Gene McCarthy challenge, but once McCarthy had shown his strength, Kennedy steps into the fight of this itself, and Kennedy seems to be this ideal coalition candidate. He's not just appealing to sort of the John Kennedy mystique, he's appealing to blue-collar workers of that. He's appealing to ethnic minorities, racial minorities, key parts of the Democratic Party that are well beyond the reach of Gene McCarthy of this there. And soon there's sort of a two-way fight for president in the Democratic primaries between McCarthy and Bobby Kennedy. And the crucial election is early June in California. And it's a closely fought contest. And finally, around midnight, the results are conclusive. Kennedy has won the election. And there is a radio reporter that is talking to Kennedy, interviewing him right when Kennedy is declaring victory. And all of a sudden, and there's a gunman out here, don't shoot that gun at me. It's a very dramatic scene where the assassination of Bobby Kennedy is caught on radio. In terms of that itself there. But remember Hubert Humphrey? Well, meanwhile, Hubert Humphrey had been working with the machine. He was the candidate of the insiders, and generally the way you were supposed to be a delegate to the National Convention is the boss agreed you were to be a delegate. Because what do national conventions really do? They're cheerleaders, for the most part, or the rubber stamps. By the time the National Convention, the nominee is known, he writes what's going on, and the whole thing is a big masquerade of that. That's maybe why Trump doesn't want to have masks at his convention. It'd be too much of the masquerade in terms of that itself there. And basically that's what Humphrey does, is he doesn't win a primary. He doesn't run in a primary. He just relies on the good old boys. And the ideal place to have the 1968 National Democratic Convention for the Democrats is in Chicago. And at this time, the boss of Chicago is Mayor Daley. And Mayor Daley has had this stranglehold over Chicago since the early 1950s, and he is a good machine Democrat, has ties with both the Kennedy organization and the Humphrey organization. And part of the credit and power of Mayor Daley is he knows how to turn out the vote. And in some cases, the elections are so controversial in Chicago that the dead roll over in their graves. In other cases, the dead get up and they vote in Chicago elections under Mayor Daley. And in fact, in 1960, the results of Illinois between Kennedy and Nixon are razor thin. And thanks to Mayor Daley, Kennedy lands up winning in Illinois out of it, giving him the White House, it said. And meanwhile, Mayor Daley is also the kind of politician who does not believe in any dissent. He is the candidate of law and order, defined as a policeman's club. And you disagree with Mayor Daley or any of the members of his police department, they have their clubs or other things to get done with you. He has his constituencies out of that. And meanwhile, on the scene, the yippies come out. And the yippies are the wackos of the day out of it. You have hippies, and if you have hippies, you can have yippies. And a yippie is a member of the Youth International Party. And the idea of the yippies is that politics are a total charade, therefore we should advertise them as a total charade. And they decide that the ideal candidate for president is Pegasus the pig. And so they go to Chicago for the convention with a greased pig. They have the greased pig and they release it. And part of the old rodeo farm sport of trying to capture a greased pig, it's hard. And here you have Pegasus the pig running around for a half hour, 45 minutes before the animal control division can capture it itself. And they call on all the anti-war protesters to come to Chicago to have a festival of life. And Mayor Daley, with the full support of the federal government, prepares for this by overwhelming force. And from the first day of the convention to the last day, there is extreme violence on the part of the Chicago police against any and all protesters, not just the yippies, but also the McGovern crowd, the McCarthy crowd, the remnants of the Bobby Kennedy crowd are all getting their clubs as well. And the Democratic campaign convention nominates Humphrey, who gives the most uninspiring, blah, nothing speech imaginable as his statement. And against all of this, Tricky Dicky is the moderate in the campaign. And Tricky Dicky was looking for a job in 1946 as a veteran in Southern California, and he's not sure whether he's going to get a job with an orange juice sales company or the local Republican Party needed a candidate for Congress, and he soon showed he was a master of dirty politics in one way or another out of this. And he always had this idea that the role of a politician is to do good for the community by doing well for himself, by having various slush funds, other such things. And at no time, Nixon in Washington is a professional anti-communist red baiter, a very, very questionable financial integrity. And he's the man that President Dwight Eisenhower selects as vice president in 1952. And he barely loses to JFK in 1960. He then goes out to California to run for governor in 1962 and narrowly loses the gubernatorial election to a guy named Pat Brown, which is one of these pivotal events in American political history. Number one, in the wake of his defeat, Nixon turns on the press and he has a statement: "You won't have Nixon to kick around anymore. I have had it with you reporters. I'm not going to give my high services to the country anymore. I'm going to New York and going to become a rich Wall Street lawyer." Well, the other thing is, Pat Brown is sort of the corporate liberal of corporate liberals in California, who is so unpopular in 1966 that he is defeated by Ronald Reagan in the 1966 campaign. They're sort of giving rise to the whole Reagan phenomenon itself on that. So anyway, this is the chaos of an uneasy, unprepared, unfocused country as the 1968 convention and elections approach on that. And the Democrats basically at the end have their usual position. Humphrey is a coward, he's a lickspittle, he is spineless, but he's the lesser evil to Nixon out of that there. And it's a very, very close election that Nixon barely puts through. In office, Richard Nixon is the last liberal president in the United States. You look at a lot of the liberal agenda today: EPA, environmental protection, affirmative action programs. Those were all introduced by Nixon. And Nixon was deadly afraid that the country was on the verge of explosion, and he believed that by giving a few concessions from below, the system could maintain itself. He also was building on the policies of LBJ. And by 1968, before leaving office, LBJ had more or less jettisoned the Great Society. And instead of really pushing the Great Society in 1968, the LBJ is creating something called the Law Enforcement Administration. And the Law Enforcement Administration is a federal branch of the Department of Justice that is designed to step up law and order to combat crime. And among the ways to do this, there's all this excess military equipment the Pentagon has from Vietnam. And this is the period exactly when local police departments are increasingly being filled with all sorts of deadly equipment, the rise of SWAT teams, the rise of special uniforms of these guys all dressed in black that may have police on them itself. And again, Nixon is heavily going and pushing these things, and all the while he is thoroughly paranoid on that itself. And that's the real difference between Nixon and Trump. Trump when he doesn't like something, will use the biggest smear insult you can imagine. Nixon, on public statements, will state he's the moderate, the president bringing the country together, and then he goes into the Oval Office where he has his own taping system in there, and Nixon's id comes out for the occasion, and all of this lands up exploding in the wake after 1970 in terms of Watergate itself on that. But another of these key typical events that also occurs in May 1970 is the Wall Street attack on peace marchers. And in the wake of Kent State, there is a massive anti-war rally in Manhattan. The rally goes in the Wall Street area, including where the World Trade Center building is arising, in a cynical collaboration between the Federal Department of Labor, George Meany, the president of the American Federation of Labor, Congress of Industrial Organizations, and leaders of the New York building trades industry. Basically, an agreement is reached that the building trade workers, especially in the Wall Street area around the World Trade Center, can have the paid afternoon off of the Peace March if during the Peace March they just conveniently land up dropping tools from 50 stories high onto the Peace March itself, and then position themselves with their hard hats, their clubs, their tools, their wrenches to physically assault and viciously beat the anti-war marchers in the area. In the wake of this, the leaders of the hard hats, as they are known, go to Washington. They are heralded by Nixon, and suddenly a hard hat has quite a strong political connotation, and nobody more personifies this than Fred Flintstone. And Fred Flintstone was a construction worker. As soon as there are the hard hat riots, suddenly Fred Flintstone is wearing a hard hat in his cartoons as something of a statement of the idea. A further consequence of this is that our building trade workers that need to represent themselves against management, or are they collaborators against management as a kind of proto-fascist force? And before long, the labor movement starts collapsing. And when it's obvious that the labor movement much prefers to have the hard hat approach, the pro-war approach, Wall Street says, hey, this is a great idea. These guys aren't going to fight back. And that's sort of the beginning of the modern, very successful attack on labor unions itself, on that itself. So all of this now, of course, has to come back to Denver. And amidst all of this, Denver Public Schools is now officially integrated in September 1970, thanks to the federal courts. And typical is what happens at South High School. South, over the years, had been an overwhelmingly lily-white school with very, very strict enforcement discipline, and black kids come on the bus according to the court order. They don't know where they are. They don't know how they're supposed to behave. They don't know what they're supposed to be doing. There's been no orientation, and they're lost in the program. And why are they lost in the program? They are recalcitrant, and they deserve punishment for being recalcitrant. And the bus system is unreliable, and they show up at school 10 minutes late. And isn't this a punishable affair for them being tardy? And soon the white administrators are just so cracking down on the black students, there's a race riot at South High School of an unbending administration. There's a comparable problems at George Washington High School. By this time, the superintendent of schools is Howard Johnson. He was once a most successful coach at South High School, who's a decent administrator, but when there's a problem, Howard Johnson's response is, you know, across the street from school headquarters is this nice little tavern. Why don't you meet me and we'll discuss this over a drink or two or three. And so for about 3 years, Denver has this inebriated school superintendent that has absolutely no muscle in terms of going and trying to see that school integration works of that. And meanwhile, a lot of parents are voting with their feet. They're moving out of the city. At the time of the original school busing order, Denver Public Schools had about 97,000 students in a city of 500,000 population. Within 10 years, there's about 67,000 students as Denver's population is plunging. This and the busing efforts never take into account, is school success simply a matter of black and white? Or is it the class background of the parents, whether the parents are encouraging their children to read, participate, and school teachers are always saying, read with your children. There's an amazing number of houses that don't have one book in them. The parents never read. How are they supposed to read to their children for the occasion out of that itself? And these issues just keep being avoided. And meanwhile, the United States District Court has this iron hand. And before long, they're saying, well, what about children of Hispanic heritage? Are they a class in and of themselves? And soon the federal courts are saying that Denver is a tri-ethnic district and special efforts need to be done at bilingual education itself. So there's this further polarization, increasingly sort of the sturdy white middle class that if it can avoid Denver public schools, does so. The number of private schools soars in the course of the 1970s. There's all sorts of dodges because what they have on at the elementary level are what are called paired elementary schools. Like, for example, not that far from the campus is Greenlee School over at 12th and Lee Pond. Its students land up being bused over for grades 1, 2, and 3 to Trailer School, which is in the Bear Valley neighborhood at about South Ivan Way and West Golden Avenue or so. Out of it there, and the Greenlee students, they ride the bus over to Trailer. Very few Trailer students ride the bus over to Greenlee itself. And meanwhile, there is hearing after hearing on school busing through the 70s, through the 1980s. It doesn't matter whether members of the school board are pro-busing or anti-busing. By this time, United States District Court Judge Richard Mach is saying Denver is going to have busing. It doesn't matter if people are learning anything, we must have busing. Denver must be a unitary district. And all the while, from 65% of the total student enrollment, whites are soon about 25% of the total student enrollment. And the upshot is that by 1995, nobody has any enthusiasm left for busing. It hasn't accomplished its idyllic goals of that. And finally, Judge Mach says, enough already. At the end of the 1995-96 school year, busing is no longer going to be needed. I am declaring Denver a success thanks to 26 years of court intervention and orders out of that. And so that's basically what my new book, The Denver School Busing Wars, is all about, plus all sorts of other details of what goes on in the schools during this period. It's $25 in bookstores, yours today for $20. It's actually volume 2 of a trilogy. Volume 1 is simply called the Denver School Book, that looks at the origins of the school system from the time of the Pikes Peak Gold Rush, when Auraria, of course, was the home of the first school in the area, until Kenneth K. Oberholzer leaves as superintendent in 1967. What I'm working on right now is Volume 3, Schools for a New Century, about some of the chaos that's happened since then, and whether Denver Public Schools is a rational organization or what goes on. I'm not quite sure what the answer to that is itself. Ideally, that should be out in a year or so. Finally, I have a couple of other books, cheap. If you're interested on this, I have a book out called Robert Spears' Denver, about Denver 100 years ago, including the 1918 flu epidemic, the streetcar strike, things like that. $25 in bookstores, yours today for only $5. And then a detail about the streetcar strike is in the wake of the streetcar strike, there is massive disillusionment, and some people, including workers, are saying there's this new group out there, and it's guaranteeing it's fighting for a 100% pure white, all-American Christian community that's going to include us as the workers. And that group was the Ku Klux Klan that surges to power in the 1920s. And what happens there is the story of In the Shadow of the Klan, $25 in bookstores, yours today for $10. So with that said, final questions, comments, ideas, rebuttals, and this even includes Seth Bradley in there. Well, anyway, thanks for showing up as our little part of history, for better or for worse there.